In a remote village, tucked away amidst the sprawling hills and dense forests, life was simple, almost timeless. The villagers lived in harmony with the land, waking at the first light of dawn to tend to their fields, and resting when the sun dipped below the horizon. The gentle rhythm of the seasons dictated their lives, spring for planting, summer for harvesting, and autumn for feasts. The quiet whispers of life were broken only by the occasional storm or the rustle of the trees. Nothing extraordinary ever happened here. But then, on one fateful morning, a child was born who would change everything. That day, the sun rose slow and golden, casting long shadows over the green valley. A cool mist, thick with the scent of jasmine and earth, hung over the village, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. In a small cottage at the edge of the village, Mira and Ravi welcomed their daughter into the world. The room, filled with the warmth of flickering candles, suddenly seemed brighter with her arrival. Sonia's first cries echoed through the room like a song, and for a moment, everything outside seemed to pause, suspended in a quiet reverence. The midwife, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a lifetime of wisdom, took the child into her arms. But when she looked down at the baby, something unusual happened. Her hands, typically steady, trembled as she gazed at the infant's face. She had seen many babies in her time, but none like this one. Mira, exhausted but smiling, looked at her daughter with a mixture of awe and tenderness. "She's so beautiful," she whispered, her voice soft as a lullaby. The midwife's voice broke the silence, her tone reverent and uneasy. "Mira, this child, she is unlike any I have seen before. There's something in her eyes, something beyond this world. She is," her words faltered. "She is not ordinary." Ravi, who had been standing silently by Mira's side, knelt down beside his wife. His large, calloused hands gently cupped the tiny fingers of his newborn daughter. As he looked at her, he too was struck by the child's beauty, a beauty that was startling, even in a place where beauty was not often noticed. "Perfect," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. But even as he said the word, a seed of concern began to take root in his heart. Ravi was a man of practicality, who believed in working the land with his own hands. He knew the simple, quiet life his family led, and he understood the dangers of standing out in such a world. The village had its fair share of superstition, and too often, beauty, especially the kind that could take one's breath away, was not viewed as a gift, but a curse. As the day wore on, word of Sonia's birth spread quickly. By midday, neighbors came to offer congratulations and peer at the newborn. But their words, meant to celebrate, were laced with something darker. "She is as beautiful as a goddess," one of the older women whispered in awe. Her voice was laced with reverence, but there was something else, a hidden edge in her gaze that Mira didn't miss. "Such beauty," another woman murmured. "It will bring blessings to this family." But then there were the whispers from others, voices that Mira could barely hear but that still sent a shiver down her spine. "She's too beautiful to be the daughter of simple farmers like Ravi and Mira," one man muttered as he gazed at Sonia. "Perhaps she's not really theirs. She must be some kind of divine child, sent by the gods." Even the village priest, a man known for his unwavering faith, had visited their humble home. When he laid eyes on Sonia, his expression hardened. He muttered prayers under his breath, his words laced with reverence, yet there was an undertone of wariness in his voice. He claimed that the child was destined for greatness, but the priest also seemed unsettled, unsure whether that greatness would bring blessings or curses. That night, as the village grew quiet, Mira lay awake in her bed, gazing at her daughter, who slept peacefully in her crib. Despite the joy in her heart, a sense of unease settled in her chest, one that she couldn't ignore. She reached out for Ravi, who was lying beside her, his back turned toward her. "Ravi," she whispered softly, afraid of what she might say. "Have you noticed how they look at her? The villagers, they don't just admire her. They envy her." Ravi remained still for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly. "They're just amazed by her beauty, Mira. They don't know what to make of it." Mira shook her head. "No, it's more than that. There's something in their eyes, a kind of hunger. It's as if they want something from her, something that doesn't belong to them." Ravi sighed deeply, sitting up in the bed. His hand instinctively rested on the pendant Mira had worn for years, a symbol of their family's heritage, as he tried to calm her. "I understand your fears, but our daughter is a blessing, Mira. She will be loved by many." "I hope you're right," Mira murmured, though doubt lingered in her heart. As the days passed, it became clear that Sonia's beauty was not only a source of awe but also of fear and suspicion. The villagers, who had once been a close-knit community, began to distance themselves from Ravi and Mira, their admiration turning into envy and resentment. Mira's worries deepened, and one evening, after a long day working in the fields, she sat down with Ravi under the mango tree at the edge of their property, where the cool breeze offered a temporary reprieve from the heat. "We can't let her grow up like this," Mira said, her voice thick with emotion. "The world doesn't understand beauty like hers. It will destroy her." Ravi looked out over the land, his eyes narrowing as he thought. He could feel the weight of her words pressing on his chest. He had never been one to fear change, but what Mira was saying felt like an inevitability he couldn't escape. "What do we do, Mira?" he asked quietly. "We protect her," Mira replied firmly, "we protect her from the world." And so, with that decision, a plan was formed. The next morning, Ravi began crafting a mask. Not just any mask, but a carefully designed leather one, made to cover Sonia's face entirely, leaving only her eyes visible. He made it thick enough to be unnoticeable yet secure, something that would shield her from prying eyes and avoid drawing attention. When Sonia turned 5, her parents, with heavy hearts, placed the mask upon her face for the first time. Sonia, who had always been a joyful child, immediately cried out in confusion. "Why are you covering my face? Why can't they see me?" Mira, her voice breaking, pulled her daughter close. "Sonia, this is to protect you. The world is not ready for your beauty. People will not understand it, and they will hurt you for it." At such a tender age, Sonia could not comprehend what her mother meant. But she trusted Mira's words and allowed the mask to remain. The leather was uncomfortable against her young skin, but she soon grew accustomed to it, the weight of it becoming a familiar presence. But the loneliness began to creep in. The years passed slowly, and Sonia grew under the constant shadow of her mask. At first, she didn't fully understand the reason behind it. But as she entered school at the age of 6, the confusion and frustration began to grow. Her classmates, most of them curious children with inquisitive eyes, stared at her with a mixture of intrigue and suspicion. Some of the children tried to engage with her, speaking to her from behind their desks, but the mask muffled her voice and made it harder for her to communicate. "Why do you always wear that?" one brave girl asked one day, her words more of a challenge than an innocent question. Sonia hesitated, her small fingers brushing the edges of the mask, wishing she could pull it off. I have to," she said softly, but the words never seemed to explain enough. The other children, seeing her discomfort, slowly began to turn away. Some began to laugh behind their hands, whispers of the girl with the strange face becoming more frequent with each passing day. It wasn't long before the teasing grew worse. The girls in her class, too young to understand the significance of Sonia's mystery, began to mock her. They would gather in small groups during recess, giggling behind their hands whenever she passed. "She's so weird," one would say. "Why does she cover her face like that?" another would mutter, making sure their words were just loud enough for Sonia to hear. Sonia learned quickly to ignore them, to keep her head down and not make waves. It became a habit to walk the long dirt paths to and from school with her head slightly bowed, hiding behind the mask, avoiding the stares. Her world, once full of laughter and sunshine, had become a series of silences, punctuated only by cruel whispers that followed her wherever she went. The mask had become her shield, but it was also her prison. However, there was one boy in the village who seemed unaffected by the rumors. Arjun, the son of the village's richest merchant, was a rare kind of person, reserved, thoughtful, and unlike any of the others. He was admired for his intelligence and gentle nature, and though his family was well known, Arjun preferred the quiet of his books to the noisy chatter of his peers. He had always been different, and it was that difference that drew him to Sonia. Unlike the other children, Arjun never mocked her. In fact, he often tried to talk to her, though his attempts were always met with the same response, the soft voice of a girl too afraid to reveal her true self. One day, after school had let out, Arjun found Sonia sitting alone under a large banyan tree, her small hands clutching the edges of her mask, her eyes gazing out at the horizon. "Why do you always sit alone?" Arjun asked, sitting beside her. His voice was calm, almost like a breeze that didn't disturb the air around her. Sonia blinked in surprise. No one had ever approached her so openly before. She looked at him for a moment, the faintest spark of curiosity in her eyes. "Because?" "I have to," she replied, her voice still muffled behind the mask. Arjun tilted his head, studying her quietly. He wasn't going to let it go. "You don't have to," he said. "You don't have to hide your face." Sonia's heart skipped a beat. She had never shared the reason for the mask with anyone, not even her closest friends. The thought of revealing the truth terrified her. But something in Arjun's eyes, something kind and understanding, made her feel for the first time that it might be okay to tell him. But before she could say anything more, the bell rang, signaling the end of the break, and the other children began gathering around, their eyes still filled with curiosity. Sonia quickly stood up, adjusting her mask, and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Arjun standing alone. Over the next few weeks, Arjun continued to approach Sonia, talking to her when he could, always keeping a respectful distance. His gentle persistence, his lack of judgment, made Sonia start to wonder if he might be the one person who truly saw her for who she was, not just the girl behind the mask. But Sonia wasn't ready to let anyone see her true face, not yet. As the months passed, Arjun's affection for Sonia began to deepen. He grew to admire her intelligence and kindness. Despite the mask, there was something compelling about her, something he couldn't quite understand, but knew was special. He noticed how she would always help others, always share, even if it meant being overlooked. There was a quiet strength in Sonia that others missed, and that intrigued him. One afternoon, as Sonia sat near the riverbank after school, Arjun approached her, holding a small book in his hands. "I found this," he said, offering it to her. "It's about a girl who wore a mask because she was afraid of being judged. It's a story of bravery, about learning to face the world." Sonia took the book, her fingers brushing against his, sending a strange warmth through her. "Thank you," she said, though her voice was barely above a whisper. She didn't know how to respond, didn't know how to tell him that the story mirrored her own life in a way she couldn't explain. Arjun smiled gently. maybe one day you'll let me see what's behind the mask." Sonia looked down, a deep flush rising in her cheeks. She couldn't explain why, but something in her heart stirred. For the first time, she felt the weight of the mask as a burden, not just an object of protection. The idea of someone wanting to see her face, her true self, was both terrifying and thrilling. But was she ready?
A few years later.
During the annual village festival, Sonia found herself at a crossroads. The festivities were alive with music and laughter, with villagers celebrating the harvest and the changing seasons. For the first time in years, she had the opportunity to take off her mask. The festival was an anonymous place for many, where people could shed their usual roles and simply enjoy life. As she walked through the crowd, the laughter and the music filled the air, and for a moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: freedom. No one knew her here. No one expected anything of her. Arjun, as usual, was there, watching from the sidelines, his eyes following Sonia wherever she went. She felt the pull of his gaze, and something inside her stirred. Perhaps it was the hope that he would see beyond the mask. When she found a quiet space in the garden, away from the crowd, she stood in front of a mirror, staring at her reflection. The mask that had concealed her for so long felt heavy, almost suffocating. She thought of Arjun's words, of his kindness, of his gentle persistence. Could she trust him? Could she trust herself? Her hands trembled as she lifted the mask and set it aside. The cool evening air brushed against her bare face, and for the first time in her life, Sonia felt exposed, but not vulnerable. There was no fear of judgment, no hiding behind the barrier she had created. As she walked back into the festival, she met Arjun's gaze across the crowd. His eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Sonia's heart raced. What would he think? Would he reject her? Would he see her as the strange, ugly girl they all assumed she was? But then, to her surprise, Arjun smiled, a smile filled with warmth and admiration. Slowly, he made his way through the crowd toward her. "You're beautiful," he said softly, his voice filled with awe. Sonia looked down, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. I don't know how to be anything else." Arjun gently lifted her chin, his touch soft and reassuring. "You don't have to be anything else," he said. "You're already perfect, just as you are." The night was alive with the sounds of celebration, but for Sonia, the world seemed to slow. Arjun's words echoed in her mind, replaying over and over again. "You're beautiful. You're perfect, just as you are." Her heart fluttered in her chest, and for the first time, she began to believe it. The mask she had worn for so many years, which had shielded her from the world, suddenly felt like a distant memory, something she could leave behind. It was as if Arjun's gentle words had unlocked something inside her, a part of her soul that had been buried beneath the weight of fear and uncertainty. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Arjun and Sonia spent time together, talking and laughing like old friends. His kindness, his unwavering respect for her, made her feel lighter than she had ever felt in her life. The world, for once, seemed kinder, less judgmental. The laughter around them no longer felt mocking. Instead, it felt like a part of the rhythm of life that Sonia was beginning to dance to, freely and without the constraints of the mask. But even as she basked in this newfound sense of liberation, a nagging thought remained in the back of her mind: what would happen tomorrow? The village, though small and often kind, still carried whispers and judgments. Even if Arjun had accepted her, what would the others think? Would they, too, see her as he did, or would they still whisper behind her back, still point and mock? The fear of rejection, of being seen as different in a world that often valued conformity, was hard to shake. The next day, as Sonia walked through the village, she felt the eyes of the people on her. The once familiar whispers now seemed louder, sharper. She could hear the gasps as she passed, the hushed murmurs between villagers. "Is that really her?" someone asked. "What happened to her face?" Another voice, full of disbelief, said, "I thought she was hiding a deformity." "But the words trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. Sonia's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't look down. She kept walking, keeping her head held high, though every step felt like a test of her resolve. The tight grip of anxiety in her chest was hard to ignore. She passed a group of children who, the day before, had teased her relentlessly. Today, however, they stared at her with wide eyes. The looks they gave her were different, curious, almost in awe. A few of the older girls whispered to each other, their gazes flicking to Sonia as if trying to understand her newfound freedom. Despite the discomfort, Sonia felt a sense of pride rising in her chest. She had removed the mask, and while she knew there would always be people who didn't understand, there were those who saw her, really saw her, for the first time. Arjun, of course, was one of those people. And that, for now, was enough to keep her going. As she made her way to school that day, Arjun was waiting for her, leaning against a tree just outside the school gates. His face lit up when he saw her, his eyes full of warmth and something else, something deeper. Without a word, he walked toward her, and for the first time, she felt the weight of his gaze not as judgment, but as admiration. "Morning, Sonia," he greeted, his smile gentle but sincere. "Good morning," she replied, her voice still soft, but stronger now, more confident than before. As they entered the classroom together, the other students were still whispering, casting furtive glances in their direction. But Arjun, always calm and unfazed by the chatter, walked beside her as though nothing had changed. Sonia's classmates, seeing his reaction, began to shift in their seats. If Arjun wasn't afraid of the mystery behind Sonia's face, perhaps they shouldn't be either. Slowly but surely, their curiosity grew, and the teasing began to subside. However, there were still moments of tension, of confusion, of uncertainty, but Arjun remained by her side, and his unwavering presence gave her the strength to face them. Over the next few weeks, Sonia and Arjun spent more time together. Arjun, who had been the first to accept Sonia without judgment, became her closest friend, and in time, her confidant. They would study together after school, go for long walks by the river, and talk about everything and nothing. In those moments, Sonia felt safe, more than she had ever felt before. She began to open up to Arjun, sharing her fears and insecurities, her hopes for the future. And with each passing day, she saw him not just as a friend, but as someone who truly understood her in a way no one else did. Sonia began to realize that her beauty, which had once been her greatest burden, could be a gift. It wasn't just her appearance that made her special, it was her kindness, her intelligence, her strength in the face of adversity. Her face, once hidden behind a mask, became a symbol of her courage. And then, one evening, as they sat under the stars by the river, Arjun turned to her, his eyes full of affection. "Sonia," he began, his voice soft, "I've been thinking a lot lately. I think you're incredible. And not just because of what you look like, but because of who you are. You're strong. You've faced so much, and you still stand tall. That's more beautiful than anything." Sonia's heart skipped a beat. She had never heard anyone speak to her like this before, really speak to her. It wasn't about her mask, or her looks, or anything superficial. It was about her. "I don't know if I can ever thank you enough for being kind to me," Sonia replied, her voice thick with emotion. "You made me see that maybe I don't have to hide anymore. Not from anyone. Not even from myself." Arjun smiled, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply sat there, side by side, watching the stars twinkle above them. The days grew warmer, and with it, the connection between Arjun and Sonia deepened. One afternoon, after a particularly challenging day, when the village's judgment had once again stung too deeply, Sonia found herself sitting alone in the garden, staring at the horizon. Arjun found her there, his footsteps soft against the grass. Without a word, he sat beside her. The air was quiet, save for the distant sound of children laughing and the rustle of leaves in the wind. "Sonia," he said, his voice low, "I need to tell you something." Sonia looked at him, her heart racing. She had known this moment was coming. His gaze was filled with something she had seen growing over time: affection, respect, admiration, and perhaps something more. I think I love you, Arjun said, his voice steady but his eyes full of sincerity. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and real. Sonia's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. She hadn't expected this, hadn't realized that in opening herself to him, she might find something deeper than friendship. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The weight of his words was both overwhelming and beautiful. Finally, she whispered, her voice trembling, I love you too, Arjun. I've always been afraid of what people might think of me, but with you, I feel like I can be myself. And that's all I ever wanted. Arjun reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. Then be yourself, Sonia. You don't need a mask. Not with me. And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the evening, Sonia knew that the hardest journey was already over. She had found herself, and in doing so, had found someone who loved her for everything she was. The mask had been her prison, but now, she was free. The days following Sonia's confession to Arjun were filled with a new sense of freedom. The mask, which had once shielded her from the world, was now gone, not just physically, but emotionally. No longer did she carry the weight of fear and insecurity, but instead, a renewed sense of self. Each day felt like a new beginning, a chance to live authentically and without shame. But Sonia knew that her journey was far from over. The villagers, though they had seen her without the mask, were still not used to the change. There were still whispers, still looks of confusion, some even tinged with disdain. It was hard for them to let go of the image they had created of Sonia, the mysterious, masked girl who was so beautiful that it seemed almost unnatural. Yet, as time passed, something unexpected began to happen. The very things that had once made Sonia feel like an outsider, her beauty, her differences, began to inspire change within the village. Slowly, the whispers turned from judgment to admiration. They no longer saw her as a figure to be feared or envied. Instead, they began to see her strength, her resilience, and the grace with which she carried herself. One afternoon, as Sonia was walking with Arjun by the riverbank, they were stopped by an older woman from the village, Mrs. Patel. She was known for being one of the more traditional villagers, often reluctant to accept change, yet today, she looked at Sonia with a softness in her eyes. You've become a symbol for all of us, Mrs. Patel said, her voice trembling slightly. The courage it took to remove that mask. I never thought I'd see the day when someone would be brave enough to show the world their true face, flaws and all. Sonia blinked in surprise. Mrs. Patel had always been one of the more judgmental figures in the village, and yet here she was, acknowledging Sonia's transformation. She smiled warmly. Thank you, she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Don't thank me, Mrs. Patel replied. You've shown us that beauty doesn't have to be hidden. That it's not about perfection or conformity. It's about being true to who we are. Sonia was speechless. Her heart swelled with emotion as she realized the profound effect her decision had on the village. What had started as a personal choice, removing the mask and revealing herself, had evolved into a powerful statement that rippled through the community, forcing others to reconsider their preconceived notions of beauty, identity, and worth. As the months went by, Sonia's relationship with Arjun grew deeper. She began to realize that the love she had found in him was not just romantic, but also healing. Arjun had been the first person to see her for who she truly was, and his love had allowed her to see herself in the same light. His unwavering belief in her beauty, not just on the surface, but in the depths of her heart and soul, gave her the confidence to embrace all that she was. But this love was also about growth, not perfection. There were days when Sonia still felt self-conscious, when doubts crept into her mind and old fears resurfaced. The sting of judgment could still be felt, especially when people who had once admired her began to look away, unsure of how to react to her new, unmasked self. But Arjun was always there to steady her, to remind her of the strength she had shown in taking off the mask. With each passing day, Sonia learned to love herself more, not in spite of her imperfections, but because of them. On one particularly quiet evening, as they sat together on the porch of Sonia's house, watching the sun dip behind the hills, Arjun took her hand in his. He turned to her, his expression serious. "Sonia," he said softly, "there's something I've been thinking about." Sonia turned to him, her heart fluttering at the intensity in his gaze. "What is it?" "I know this is a small village, and that we come from different worlds in some ways," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I want you to know that I've never been more sure of anything in my life than I am of you. You're everything I could ever want. And I don't care what anyone else thinks about us." Sonia's breath caught in her throat. She had never heard such honesty from him before. His words, raw and vulnerable, made her heart swell. "I love you too, Arjun," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "And no matter what happens, I promise I won't hide from you. I won't hide from anyone anymore." He smiled, a genuine, heartwarming smile that reached his eyes. "Then let's keep living this life, together. Let's show the world that we're not afraid of who we are." And in that moment, Sonia knew that she had found not only love, but a kindred spirit, a person who saw her, truly saw her, for everything she was, without any barriers. But even as Sonia felt the peace of acceptance settle over her, there was one final challenge waiting for her, a challenge that would test everything she had learned. The village was hosting its annual festival, a celebration that brought together people from all around. It was a time of joy, music, and dancing, but also of competition. The festival's grand event was the beauty contest, a tradition that had been passed down through generations. The winner would receive a crown of flowers and the title of village beauty, a title that had long been associated with physical appearance, poise, and charm. Sonia had never thought about entering before. She had always kept to the shadows, afraid of what it would mean to be judged in such a way. But this year, something was different. Arjun's love, the village's new acceptance, and the strength she had found in herself pushed her to reconsider. One evening, just days before the festival, Arjun brought up the idea. "You know, Sonia," he said as they walked together under the stars, "you don't have to enter the contest. But I think you would win it, if you wanted to. You've got everything it takes, inside and out." Sonia stopped, her heart thudding in her chest. "I don't know, Arjun. What if I don't fit into that mold? What if they still judge me, even now?" Arjun smiled, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "You've already shown them who you are, Sonia. You're beautiful in ways they can't even imagine. Don't let anyone decide your worth for you. If you want to enter, do it for yourself. Not for anyone else." And so, after much thought, Sonia decided to take that leap. The night of the festival, she stood at the center of the stage, facing the crowd, with Arjun by her side. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen. Her beauty was no longer a mask to hide behind, it was her truth. And as she stood there, in front of everyone, she realized that she had nothing left to fear. The crowd, silent at first, began to clap. Slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm, they cheered for her. Not because she was the most beautiful or the most polished, but because they finally saw her for who she truly was, a strong, brave young woman who had the courage to stand tall in the face of judgment, and to live her truth, unmasked. Sonia won the title that night, but the real victory was not the crown she received, it was the freedom she had found in herself, and the love she had discovered, not only from Arjun, but from the world around her. As she looked at Arjun, standing proudly beside her, she knew that her journey had only just begun. She had found herself, and in doing so, had discovered a love that was pure, a love that had the power to change everything. And for the first time, Sonia knew that she could face the world, beautiful, unmasked, and fearless.